Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Katarina Klingova. I'm the Senior Research Fellow at Globsec Policy Institute. Globsec is an international think tank based in Bratislava, and I would gladly welcome you today at this webinar on election integrity, not only in COVID pandemic times. I'm very much honored that I can welcome today my distinguished guests. I would like to introduce you and welcome Dr. Beata Martin-Rozumilovic, Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Corina Rebegea, Director of Democratic Resilience Program of Central European Center for European Policy Analysis, and Zofia Lutkiewicz, the Vice President of the Political Accountability Foundation. Thank you very much today and for joining me. I know that we are on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm very glad that you managed to and agreed to take part on this webinar. Electoral integrity has been subject of many disinformation outlets and discourse even before the pandemic. We ourselves did a 5-month-long electoral monitoring prior to the Slovak parliamentary elections, and there were a lot of actors that tried to diminish this democratic process and tried to undermine the electoral integrity, either saying that elections were rigged and influenced by mainstream media, by foreign agents, by NGOs, even by polling that was being rigged, and that was not even the pandemic times. So what's happening at the moment? Why some countries decided to eventually not hold the election and postpone them on later times? Why are certain regimes trying to push for the elections? Beata, you have experience for years and years of election monitoring. What's happening on the ground? Who are these actors that are pushing for these elections? And can elections be held free and fairly during the COVID pandemic times?
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Super. So thank you very much for having me on this forum. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on this issue with the audience. I think it's one which is really essential at this point in time. And I wanted to start by saying that countries, I think, have really been blindsided by this COVID pandemic. And so, although many countries have been expecting something like this for years, after the swine flu, after SARS, after Ebola, and many had gone as far as establishing lessons learned exercises and specific groups to deal with planning for the future, much of this was disbanded in past years. And so when the COVID crisis emerged, there was an inability to deal quickly and efficiently with it on the part of many large and important countries in the world. Nevertheless, with the rapid spread, and especially with the tragedies in Italy and in Spain, many countries in the Europe and Eurasia region went into rapid lockdown while this was still at a very early stage. And so the results in some countries have been very different than in the United States or the United Kingdom or Italy or Spain. Many of them also had elections that they had postponed in order to implement their stay-at-home orders. And many of them now are looking to come out of lockdown, as you mentioned, in Slovakia, but also in many other countries which haven't suffered the same fate. And so they are now considering rescheduling their elections as early as this summer. So the countries that we are particularly watching in the region from the side of IFES include Armenia, where there was supposed to be a national referendum held, Kyrgyzstan, where there were supposed to be local elections in April, Northern Macedonia, where parliamentary elections had been declared early, Poland, where presidential elections were supposed to take place in May, and Serbia, where also emergency elections had been called. And all of those were initially postponed, except for Poland, which has been continuing in some vein, and I'll get to that in a moment. But for instance, in Serbia, yesterday, they declared that they're rescheduling their elections for the 21st of June. They said that this extra week was given to make the opposition happy, even though the opposition had been boycotting the elections before the lockdown. And so also when we look at this question, to look at the political nature of the decisions that are being made. So are they being made primarily for the health of democracy or for the health of citizens, or are there other considerations that need to be taken into account? I mentioned in Poland, where the elections were never postponed, state of emergency was never formally declared, but they have tabled a bill in April for introducing postal-only voting within the space of nearly 1 month, which is a very tough thing to do without having previously piloted on a large scale. And I'd just like to mention that there's a new article that I just published today on Transitions Online about this Polish election question, and some of the details may want to come out in the questions and answers later. But in the coming months in all of these countries, there really needs to be a balance which is struck between the importance of the election themselves. So are they elections of a national character? Are they presidential elections? Are they parliamentary elections? Or are they second level elections like local elections or town council elections? And then to balance that question against the one of public safety, which needs to also be at the forefront. So can the society and the state provide the measures to keep the public safe in context of the elections, looking at their various capacity, be that financial capacity, human capacity, and other types of issues. There are also important issues that pertain, like the ability to assemble and the ability to express, especially where there is significant opposition or where there is a very polarized society. And in whatever context emerges, these freedoms really need to be protected and assured, regardless of the mode of elections that is chosen if a country so decides. There are also important issues of disinformation surrounding various aspects of this crisis. So you have the most extreme, like in Belarus, where the president told his nation that drinking more vodka and going out on the tractor while eating more garlic would protect them against COVID. But you also have more serious disinformation, like the bleach incident in the United States, and also a variety of conspiracy theories of false health information, potentially of false election disinformation. So we can imagine messages going out that polling stations in certain areas are closed, or that elections are not being held, or that postal ballots are not being received. So really voter education and proper communication are going to be crucial so that public confidence in elections is maintained. There also have been increasing calls for online voting. In my estimation, and in the estimation of many experts, this is still premature for a variety of reasons. Another article that we published with Rastlo Kuzal is, I think, also have been shared, but there is a section about internet voting. And unfortunately, with the advent of foreign actors interfering in elections, with various types of disruption in electronic voting, there are still not the security guarantees from a cybersecurity standpoint to ensure that the votes that people cast are actually tabulated at the end in the same way, and that there has been no malfeasance in between. And so really, I think it's a bit premature to start talking about those kinds of solutions, even in this condition of global pandemic where decreased participation may be an issue. For the moment, we really have only 2 examples of elections that have taken place with proper security measures during this pandemic. One is in the state of Wisconsin, and the other is in South Korea, where they recently held national elections. In the first, there are already more than 50 people that have been infected, and it seems that the measures that were introduced in Wisconsin were not as effective as might have been hoped. And so there are questions arising as to why those measures either weren't respected or weren't effective. In South Korea, there was a much more systematic effort, but also a much more compliant society, one might argue. They've also stressed the importance of their elections vis-a-vis their authoritarian past. And so many people have made the point that they really couldn't postpone the elections because they were afraid of sliding back into the authoritarianism that their country experienced before. And so for the society in South Korea, there was a feeling that these elections were so important that they had to make an effort to be able to hold them even under these conditions. That, of course, is open to argument, but that's the argument that's been presented. But many things to remember are that from a financial standpoint, the country spent more than 20 million US dollars on the procurement of personal protective equipment, or PPE. And so that's something which may not be available or may not be affordable for other countries in other contexts. So they had the luxury of having a large financial base in order to be able to make this type of procurement. They've also stressed in South Korea that their context is very important, the way that society perceives their elections is very important, and that the experience may not necessarily be transferable to other contexts. And then also important to remember is that they had a variety of measures by which people could vote. So they could vote early, 2 days in advance of elections, which meant that people came into less contact with each other. They were able to vote by post, which had been introduced in previous elections for persons with disabilities, but was expanded for this election to a wider population. And they could, of course, also vote in person in polling stations under special measures. Amongst those special measures was a very strict regime of voters coming in and initially having their temperature taken to see whether they had a fever. If they did have a fever, they were hived off into a special polling station for infected persons, which had additional protective measures, so commission members in full gear in order to be able to handle someone who potentially may be infected. Within the normal polling stations, they then proceeded to having their hands disinfected, being provided with gloves, being asked to wear masks throughout the process, having the equipment disinfected on a regular basis, having a very strict regime of social distancing, so a very limited number of people in the polling station and for a very minimal time in the polling station. And one component of that they also informed was a very widespread public information campaign so that people knew exactly what to expect before they arrived and to minimize the amount of time that they would spend in polling stations. From the official figures, the result is that only a small number of people have gotten infected who have participated in that election. Of course, the incubation period may be anywhere from 5 days to 21 plus days. And so the South Korean authorities are still following those data points very closely, but it seems that it was a much more effective and widespread use of protective measures in that election. And there are, I think, many important lessons that need to be drawn from that experience. But the lessons particularly, and this is what I'll say in closing, are that our responses really need to be measured. So they have to be balanced according to the societal needs and our ability to protect our citizens. The decisions that are taken really have to be reached in open discussions with all of the different stakeholders involved rather than behind closed doors. Otherwise, that really undermines people's confidence in whatever process results. That fundamental principles still have to apply and they can't be dispensed with in these times of emergency, whether they be principles of equality, whether they be principles of universality. And the Polish example, I think, throws up a lot of very interesting questions in that regard. But also we have to evaluate how important that election is to a society and how many people will potentially get sick as a result of taking part in that election, and make contextualized decisions about where that risk balance lies. So really not to jump to sudden untested measures, not to be innovative in trying to apply a whole new process or a whole new way of doing things at the last moment. And this particularly can really reduce public confidence and trust in an election process and potentially undermine democracy. So whatever measures are taken, that they be measured, balanced, and if any innovation takes place, that it be done in a way which is a piloted and step-by-step approach, which maybe leads to a more fundamental change later, but not last-minute changes which can undermine that trust. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thank you very much, Beata, for this very informative overview. Yes, I forgot to say that there is a question section. I mean, you can please post your questions. We'll get to them at the end of this debate. We'll definitely collect them and go through them. So please do not hesitate. Any questions to our speakers. I would like to continue with Zofia, because you, Beata, said that, you know, exactly all eyes are on Poland, who still at the moment is attempting to hold the presidential elections this Sunday. You know, Office for the Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe published a draft saying that these elections may place an unreasonable burden on the implementing bodies and jeopardize important principles of democratic elections. I want to also inquire, Zofia, you know, like you've been conducting election monitoring. To what extent did pandemic play an important role in the electoral campaign, and whether there were some discourses and narratives that try to underestimate the electoral integrity of these elections, and who were the actors that tried to push them?
Thank you very much, Katarina. Thank you for having me on this distinguished panel. So as you said, the election in Poland is scheduled to happen this Sunday still. So we find ourselves in a very complicated situation. You've mentioned for a bit the motives that the governments have when deciding whether to go on with an election or not. So in Poland, this has been very much influenced by the government's willingness to show strength, right? To show strength of the system, and the government pushed itself to act rather quickly to show that it is in the lead in the EU when it comes to its response to the pandemic. And this meant that there really is a lack of strategic thinking on how to react to the situation. There is quite an informational chaos. The government has released a lot of different bills of legislation, both when it comes to measures to alleviate the economic consequences of this pandemic, but also this chaos is very much visible when it comes to elections, right? So yesterday we had 425 new cases of people infected, 16 people died. So we're still very much not going out of this pandemic. However, the guidance from the government is that the country should start reopening. Many people consider that this is premature, and this is part of the government's efforts to show the society that holding an election soon is possible. So one thing that I want to reiterate is that even though we're still very much focused on the voting day, which is supposed to happen this Sunday, I want to talk about how elections are not just about voting, they're about an entire process, right? The preparation, candidate registration, and also about campaigning. And this has been impacted by different restrictions introduced because of the pandemic, especially restrictions to freedom of movement. So as you mentioned, we've been conducting social media monitoring of this election campaign. So the campaign started more or less 2 months ago, before really the pandemic hit, before we had the first case in Poland. However, once the state of pandemic has been declared and restrictions to freedom of movement have been put in place, most of the campaigning has moved online. So we did social media monitoring. We started doing it at the end of March, once candidate registration closed. So far, we've analyzed more or less 8,000 posts. So we've been monitoring mostly the campaign on Facebook, focusing on 3 groups of accounts, and these are the official accounts of candidates, the accounts of media outlets, and possible accounts that could be spreading disinformation. So we're still very much going through the materials that we have, but so far the main takeaways are that coronavirus has really dominated the media landscape in Poland. If you look at the numbers, nearly 46% of posts made by media outlets are about the coronavirus. So this is quite significant. This figure is a bit lower for posts made by candidates. It's about 20 to 25%. So you can see that candidates are trying to introduce other topics through the use of social media and through the use of the freedom that online campaigning gives. But if you look at broader figures, if you merge figures for 3 main narratives that we've discovered, so the coronavirus, the elections, which have been widely discussed in Poland for the past 2 months, and the economy, so the impact the coronavirus has on elections and the economy. This has been the main issue overall, and the share of these topics is as high as 70 or even 75%. And this shows that the campaign has been quite dominated by the coronavirus, and that the candidates have had a really limited opportunity to focus on other topics they wanted to introduce to the political discourse. Another takeaway that we've discovered so far is that, especially in the past 2 or 3 weeks, so around from the middle of April, we have seen a clear rise in the activity of some disinformation outlets. This is mainly Sputnik, but also a couple of others. So we're still analyzing the narratives. From what we can see for now, they've mostly been informing about what's happening in the country with regards to the coronavirus, with regards to the elections as well. But just looking at the number of posts, you can see that this has raised significantly over the past 2 or 3 weeks. We don't want to make any assumptions for now, but if this trend continues, possibly we could extrapolate or investigate further, but possibly this could be an attempt to have some kind of coordinated action around the time of the elections in Poland. So, and obviously, I mean, we've been looking at social media mostly, but also to say something about the general media environment. I mean, a state of crisis really gives an opportunity to people who are in government to use this opportunity to talk to the nation. So you can see the current president, Andrzej Duda, he has been making frequent press conferences, announcements to the people, and he has been also using very much the state outlet, the state television, which, as some of you may know, has been very much politicized over the past couple of years. So, as I said, elections are not just about election day. I will talk about a bit more about the issues around election day later, but just wanted to stress this point that there is an uneven playing field already, no matter what happens with this Sunday's election. Thank you.
Thank you, Zofia, for this insight into the Polish elections and what's happening on the ground in Poland. It was very insightful, and I hope that, I mean, the situation is going to solve itself quickly because, I mean, you know, May 10th is really behind the corner. But I would like to follow up on what actually you and Beata said, you know, that we need to distinguish whether these are very important elections and whether, you know, whether there is a strategic thinking being implemented prior to these elections. And I want to inquire and ask Corina, you know, in November, US presidential elections are supposed to take place. Already the last presidential elections in 2016 were very much disputed. A lot of foreign actors, bots and trolls were identified to, you know, try to were identified of trying to interfere in the political discourse, trying to sway it for a particular way. You know, we're in 2020, 4 years afterwards. What has changed? Did the US administration implemented measures that make it much more secure? Is the discourse better? You know, did it got worse with the pandemic? Can we see that particular actors are being more active and trying to push forward these narratives, trying to, you know, underestimate the electoral integrity?
Thank you, Katarina, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's very timely and it's very important, and I think now the whole world is watching what's happening with the Polish elections more so than with the US elections. But just to broaden a little bit the aperture before answering your question, I think what we're seeing in this crisis with a whole range of democratic processes, not just the elections, is the pre-existing institutional weaknesses or political weaknesses being exacerbated. So a lot of the governance gaps that many countries all over the world already were confronted with are currently made more important, and the impact of the crisis is likely to be also far-reaching into the future, into how these processes will play out in the months and years to come. So when I think about elections both in the US and in Europe, now there are a series of considerations, and both Zofia and Beata have alluded to that. And one have to do with the day of the elections and the safety and security of voters and of election personnel, and ensuring that process is fair and clear and predictable. And then the entire ecosystem of processes that in the lead up to the elections. And I think the way we judge this ecosystem, this process, also has to do with whether this is part of a trend that we have been seeing in a particular region or a particular country. And I think that's important to note because what will happen this year with a series of elections is perhaps going to confirm some of the trends, the worrying trends that we have seen in these countries even before we were confronted with a public health crisis. Disinformation is one of them, both driven by domestic actors, but also by hostile foreign actors. Russia in particular, Zofia, you mentioned Sputnik increasing its activity. We're also seeing China particularly active on COVID-19 related narratives. So disinformation by both domestic and foreign actors is one. Then the ability to have, by opposition forces and alternative voices, to have access to mainstream media and get their message across to a variety of audiences, I think is also a common issue that is only being exacerbated by this pandemic crisis, because people don't have the opportunity to personally engage with their electorate. And then, of course, there are a series of institutional aspects, like who is in charge with organizing and overseeing the elections. Are there going to be observers, and what do observers do? Are they allowed to actually conduct the observation missions? And are their evaluations then sort of curated before publication, or are the authorities actually acting upon the recommendations or the feedback that they get from those? And then the role of courts, right, and legal certainty during the elections. And I think that's something, because you asked me about the US elections, that's something that the Wisconsin primaries have shown, the importance of legal certainty. And that's where I think a lot of questions will be raised when it comes to elections in Poland, but also in other countries that are implementing electoral reforms right before the elections or have postponed elections, so on and so forth. There are a lot of very sort of detailed legal aspects around how you send for mail-in voting, how you send it, what are the measures of control, what's the cutoff date, whether it's when the envelope was received by the election officials or when it was stamped, the date it was sent. So, and all of these issues were raised during the Wisconsin primaries. And that kind of opens the entire range of other preparation measures that Beata alluded to, mentioned, in terms of training election officials, educating the public, making sure everyone understands how to cast their ballot, making sure that people, and this is where the disinformation piece comes in, whether people trust the process. And I think voter behavior, again, is a major issue during elections, particularly in time of crisis. Are they feeling intimidated? Are they uninformed? Are they disengaged? Are they likely to be disengaged? And whether some of these measures actually lead to a de facto disenfranchisement of certain groups. And that is a major conversation happening right now in the US. And so all of these issues, I think, are common to the US and Europe, of course, European countries. I think in the US, the particularities of the system make it a little bit more complicated because you have several layers at which elections take place and are being organized, and that has implications on the organization of the system. Then you have from state to state, and also on financial and human resources. And a major conversation again right now in the US, because out of the relief package, only $400 million have been allocated to support the election infrastructure in view of the November presidential elections. And this is tremendously insufficient for the needs of the American states. And then, of course, states have different rules about mail-in voting. In some states, this is only accepted when you have a valid excuse, right? So states had to change the rules or amend their regulations saying that you can use the pandemic as an excuse not to cast your ballot in person. In other states, everyone can vote. And then there's an issue by mail. And then there's an issue of whether you need to pre-register or you're automatically registered. And again, these conversations are different in each state. Something I think that's come out in this context is the politicization of the discourse around elections. And that's not unique to the United States. It's also a feature of many elections all over the world, really. And it's very detrimental, discrediting the mere process of elections and trying to turn voters' attention to things that may not matter or weaken voter confidence is very problematic. And that feeds into the conversation about disinformation and how prepared we are to a certain extent. Quite frankly, I don't think we've prepared enough, not just in the US, but in the entire transatlantic community. After the election interference in the US in 2016, in the French presidential elections, that was Brexit referendum, but just generally since 2014, when the Russian Federation annexed Crimea and their entire disinformation apparatus was ramped up. I think we are, to a certain extent, more aware, at least in certain circles. I think in general, let's say intelligence services, administrations are kind of paying attention to the potential of infiltrating our democratic processes by hostile actors. I don't think we've taken enough steps, and I haven't seen enough concerted measures at policy level, for instance, that would bring together governments and private sector, like the social media platforms, to work together on this. So I'm afraid that what this crisis has shown us once again is that our information infrastructure and media infrastructure, and just in general, our, let's say, cognitive resilience is still not there or not ready to meet the types and scope and depth of challenges that are being posed by, mainly, like I said, by hostile foreign actors like Russia and China.
Thank you very much for your input and this like summarization and outline of all the measures that need to be taken. So Beata, you know, Corina just outlined a certain set of measures that we need to implement and should be implemented. And my question is, should we, you know, postpone the elections in every state until all the measures, whether it's the healthy measures, whether it's the protection of the voters itself, are implemented? Or, you know, who should be the authority that is going to decide whether the election should take place? Should it be the court, as in case of Wisconsin election? Should it be the epidemiologist, doctors, or should it be a political decision, as it is in case of, you know, Poland?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And I think it gets really to the heart of the matter. You know, as I made the case in my presentation, I think it's a societal decision. So I think it's, you know, a combination of all of these different factors, which has elements of politics, it has elements of constitutionality, it has very important legal elements, it has epidemiological elements to it as well. But starting from those constitutional legal elements, the first question is, can a country legally postpone their elections? So, you know, despite the challenges that this crisis presents, we still live in rule of law based societies, and it has to be done within legal norms. And so most constitutions, on the one hand, assure genuine and regular elections that have to take place in certain timeframes. And that's one of the hurdles that the United States is facing, is that the way the Constitution defines the election period, it is very difficult to adjust those elections. On the other hand, many countries, even within their constitution, provide for norms of a state of emergency, that under extraordinary circumstances, certain adjustments or certain postponements can be made. Every country is different in how they define that. In the case of Poland, for instance, there are up to 3 different states of emergency that are constitutionally defined. Nevertheless, Poland has not taken the course of declaring any one of those 3 states of emergency. So instead, they have defined a new state of pandemic or state of whatever you want to call it, but it's not within those legal norms. And so that's the first question is, if you are considering postponement, does your legal framework allow for that postponement? If so, under what conditions? If not, what steps would you need to take in order to make that happen within a legal framework? And those are questions which other states are also grappling with at the moment. So for instance, in Macedonia, they declared the emergency early elections before the pandemic hit. And so the parliament was dismissed. And now they have no legal making body in place to actually make decisions. So they're existing under a state of emergency that's been declared by the government. But in order to legislate, they would somehow have to recall their parliament. And so currently they're facing that sort of legal lacuna of how do they square the circle of trying to postpone and reschedule their elections without having a legislative body in place. In the case of Armenia, for instance, the referendum was postponed on the basis of a state of emergency, but for a very specific set of legislation that was passed for a very specific date. And so in Armenia, the question is now, if they're going to reschedule the elections, do they have to go back and repass new legislation for that referendum to happen? Or can they adjust that old legislation in some way that would make it viable for a new date? So I think, in general terms, rule of law principles need to be respected. In specific terms, the devil is in the detail, and we need to look at each society to understand if, how, and when they can postpone those election processes.
Thank you very much. You said in the beginning that having an election is a societal decision. And we have a question actually for both you and Zofia on Poland, because we saw and we keep seeing that it's the postal workers that are quite opposed to the elections being held this Sunday. They're very much, worried about their safety. So the question from one of our from the audience is eventually Poland ready for such electoral voting? Is it possible to consider postal voting in Poland as a possible substitution for regular voting? Can those 30 million voters be reached within time and their votes be accounted for? I don't know whether Beata or Zofia, please chip in.
So maybe I'll just quickly summarize, and then I'll turn over to Zofia for more detailed information. But I think, again, the question comes down to principles. And so Poland, like other countries, has committed to certain instruments like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which enshrine certain basic principles, amongst them principles of equality, principles of universality. And so the question is, with a new scheme like this, can those basic principles still be met? And I would say, with the very short time frame, with the fact that it has not been tested wide scale, and with various detailed questions, there is a big question whether those principles can be respected. So even though Poland has a passive voter registration scheme, which means that people are automatically entered into voter rolls, of course, like in many countries, people don't necessarily reside in their place of permanent residence address. And so many people potentially will not receive those voting packs because they're not at the place where they are registered. So that's one question. The second question is that there's no formal mechanism in place, either at the point where those voting packs are sent out or at the point that they're received, that anyone has to authenticate that the person who is receiving them is actually the person who is in the voter roll. And that opens up all kinds of possibility for misuse or potential fraud. And then there's additional questions regarding the universality, whether people who have the right to vote, like citizens abroad, or the homeless in Poland, which last year were given the right to vote under special measures, could still do so under this regime. And I would argue that it's very difficult difficult for them to participate, because within a month to receive voting packs abroad for people who may not be registered with their embassies would be very difficult to achieve, and then to send back in time. And for homeless people, where would they receive their voting packs has also not been thought about. So potentially large segments of the population would be disenfranchised under this scheme. I'm not saying that solutions couldn't be found with enough time and without, and with proper thought, but in the very short time space that's available, I don't think many of those principled decisions have been considered fully.
Right, I can only expand on what Beata said. I mean, I'm an election observer myself, so I have to start by saying that the rule of law is very important, and the legal system is key here. And I just want to talk a bit about what states, possibly the US or other states that are planning to hold an election soon, what they shouldn't be doing based on the Polish example. Right, so the first thing is one should not change the rules when basically don't change the rules of the game when the game is already in play, right? So the Polish government at first changed the rules by introducing postal voting for some groups of citizens, so for people over 60 and people on quarantine. Then they have attempted to introduce postal voting for everyone. This is a legislation that Beata mentioned that has been introduced to the lower house of parliament at the beginning of April, but that has only exited the upper house of the Senate yesterday night, where the Senate voted against the law on postal voting. So we are currently waiting to see what will happen again in the lower house, and whether the president will sign this legislation into force, whether it will be passed. So the key principle here is, first of all, that all the measures should be legal, right? And they should be also stable. There's a lot of international standards, and also the jurisprudence of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal clearly states that election law should not be changed within 6 months before an election is due to happen. And it's Wednesday, the election is scheduled for Sunday, and we're still unclear how the election will happen and when. The other thing I want to talk about, as Beata mentioned, is inclusion, right? Even in a state of pandemic, we have to make elections the most inclusive as possible. So by introducing postal voting for all citizens, if the bill will pass, basically the Polish government will be stripping more or less 300,000 homeless people of their rights, because they would not be able to pick up their ballots because they don't have an address. Another issue is as Poles who live abroad. There's quite a lot of them, according to the last parliamentary elections, which were held last year. Around 350,000 of them registered to vote. Currently, it will be really difficult to get those ballots delivered to them. There are no provisions put in place to do so, and also the situation in different countries is obviously different. In some countries, you can still be fined for even leaving your house. So how do you tell people? Basically, I think that asking people to choose between their health and safety, and their health and safety of their friends and families, and whether to participate in an election is simply wrong, and countries should figure out a way to host elections in a way that is safe, both for voters, but also for people who work in election commissions who have to handle those ballots, who have to count them. Another thing that I want to talk about is trust. This has been mentioned before, but just to reiterate the Polish example, what the government has done in the past couple of weeks, it has proposed to take away the rights and obligations of the Independent National Election Commission, which is tasked with conducting elections, and it has proposed to give it to the Minister of State Assets, who is a government member very close to the ruling party, very close to Jarosław Kaczyński. And this, first of all, this isn't really legal. Second of all, this doesn't build public trust to whether the vote will be conducted in a safe way. As I saw the question in chat, I mean, the delivery of 30 million ballots by the Polish Post, which, if the election was to happen this Sunday, the delivery should have started this Monday. There's still no legislation in place, so it has not started. But first of all, the Polish Post is not the most trusted institution in Polish society. It's not really deemed to be working fast and efficiently. So my foundation, we have been quite vocal about this proposed law on postal voting. But I have to say, we're not against postal voting itself. And I think that people should have the choice how they want to vote, whether it will be voting in person in polling stations, voting online, which is also a possibility that is being discussed in many countries right now, or by postal voting. However, a country should have enough time to prepare the relevant regulations and to be able to educate voters on how this postal election should be happening. And a case that is mentioned a lot in Poland, actually, also by the Prime Minister in one of his press conferences, is the case of Bavaria, which had the second round of elections by postal voting. However, I think it is important to say, and I think the Prime Minister actually forgot to mention this or failed to mention it, is that Bavaria actually introduced postal voting in 1957. Which gave them ample time to prepare this process. Whereas in Poland, according to existing legislation, postal voting is only available to people with disabilities, which is not such a big group, and still some of them decide to vote in polling stations. So the scale of postal voting in Poland has been rather low, and introducing it suddenly to 30 million people without any preparation is simply not doable either for this Sunday or even within 2 weeks. And this has been proven to Polish society over the past couple of days. I mean, we've received pictures of the ballots, and also there has been pictures in the media where basically the ballots have been circulated on the streets. They have been laying on the ground in a small town in Poland. So this also impacts the confidence and the trust of people in the state's ability to conduct this election. And this trust is extremely, extremely low at this point.
Corina, I mean, you yourself have said that between 2016 and now, you know, a lot of security measures in America have not been implemented. A lot of them have been neglected. Both Beata and Zofia has been talking about the need for new legislation. And my question would be, you know, America is a very important country. It's a very important ally to the European Union. You know, it's a world leader. Everybody has been looking a certain level. What is America doing in these times of COVID-19 pandemics? And a lot of people were, you know, questioning the electoral integrity of the 2016 presidential elections. And, you know, can we make necessary policies effective within that time scope that we have until November? And how do we ensure that both the American citizens, but also the international community, you know, trust the results of these elections, which both Beat and Zofia said is very important? And how can we build the, you know, resilience against factors within that such a short, time scope that we have. It's not a Sunday that is happening, as it's in the case of Poland. There's still plenty of time, but is it sufficient enough?
I would maybe start by saying that the conversation about how to prepare for the November elections started in March, around March, or maybe even a little earlier. So technically that would give the US states a lot of time to prepare, which doesn't mean that all the infrastructure and the programs and the voting rolls and the ballots and everything that we've already discussed about are going to be ready, particularly in this environment, this political environment, but also the COVID-19 crisis. Now, so this is very specific to, and again, this is common to other countries as well at the time, and we've talked about how much time we allow ourselves to implement new reforms. And in the US, for instance, there would not be starting from scratch with mail-in voting like in Poland or in many other European countries that kind of have been toying with this idea of changing the voting system, including moving to exclusively online system. And of course, Estonia is probably the only country that has done so completely successfully and benefiting from voter confidence. But there's an entire set of measures that are meant to ensure election integrity beyond the way we organize the voting process, right? And so if you remember, after the 2016 presidential elections, and then further on when we discussed Brexit, a lot of the conversation, of course, other elections in the world, and the example I like best is the presidential elections in the Philippines. And so when we discuss election integrity, we have to look at the entire set of rules and regulations by which, for instance, we conduct electoral campaigns, and how we finance electoral campaigns, and whether there's a potential for infiltration by foreign actors or potential of manipulating that system, whether there's enough transparency into who does what in a campaign, what are the rules for political marketing, for targeting, so on and so forth. And I think we haven't addressed those. And at the European, we haven't addressed those in terms of regulation in the US, and we haven't addressed them in the EU. There's a code of practice, of course, and tech companies have adhered to it, but I don't think we've seen a lot of adjustment, and the idea of self-regulation I don't think it stands. It needs to be some type of co-regulation. Of course, all the actors have to be involved. And I think if we start now, we're not really preparing for the whatever elections are happening this year, but we have to think about the next round of elections and the next round of elections, and what this, not only what this crisis and how this crisis is going to impact the future democratic processes, but also how we're still catching up with weaknesses and challenges from the past that we haven't really addressed.
Thank you very much. We have another question from the audience. It is, what should be the response from the international community if mail-in voting happens in Poland in May, in particular in the United States and the EU? So, I don't know, Zofia, Beata, what should be the response, Corina, if this elections is going to be held?
So maybe I can start by saying that as an election observer that is gearing up to actually observe this election, I wouldn't like to make any initial judgments about the conduct. However, we can see already from the pre-voting environment that the election is quite flawed. I personally would like to see a rather strong response, especially from the European Union, to if in-mail voting happens, because this will be a very flawed election, if it can be called an election. Especially, there's I think one more thing that needs mentioning is that I think citizens need to know that they have some recourse, right? If they find a flaw in the electoral system, they should be able to file an electoral protest to the court, and the court should be able to fairly adjudicate it. However, what has been happening with the judiciary in Poland over the past couple of years, and even recently with the takeover of the Supreme Court, who basically votes on the validity of the election, doesn't really ensure that Polish citizens have this recourse. So I think the voice of the international community will be quite important here. However, as we've been seeing for quite some time in Poland, this actually can be used or spinned by the government against the international community. I mean, we've seen an opinion, a legal opinion from ODIHR in I think last week, and if I'm not mistaken, 1 or 2 days after this opinion was issued, you saw the the deputy prime minister of Poland, who said that ODIHR is just an office of some institutions. So if institutions like ODIHR and the OSCE don't really have are not really respected, and the Polish government can just take any opinion right now and basically use other resources, especially the public television, to use it against the person or the institution issuing this opinion. So I'm afraid that if there is a strong response from the international community, we would still see the Polish government saying that it's the international community interfering in Poland's domestic matters. And I think it's quite unfortunate, but I think that still to a large portion of Polish society, a strong reaction from the international community is very important.
You worked for many years for ODIHR, so how we can, support this voice of ODIHR to be much more respectable among the member states, such as Poland? I mean, is there a way how to raise their importance and say in these matters?
Yeah, I think, I agree with Zofia that a strong response is necessary. And I think that especially those partners, so the OSCE is a intergovernmental organization of 57 participating states. All of them are at different stages of their democratic development, but for at least those countries that are proponents and supporters of democratic practice, I think at this moment they need to be quite vocal, both bilaterally and also multilaterally, about the principles that countries have signed up to, that they've agreed to, and to hold them to account for measures which they're introducing now, which may not be in line with those promises that they've made to the international community. And I think it needs to be couched in terms which are understandable to those countries, but in many ways the situation in Poland and also in Hungary, which Ivan Godarski has mentioned in the comments, is really a bellwether for the region. So over the last few years, we've been seeing backsliding in many countries in terms of democratic principles, but these are two processes that really test whether we're still working within democratic norms or whether we've moved beyond that sort of framework. And if we're moving beyond that framework, that has really important repercussions for the international community in terms of those institutions and agreements that we have created over the past 30 years. So I think it's absolutely essential that we bring attention to that in those terms.
Thank you for your insight. We have another question from the audience. To what extent can we assume that AI will have an effect on the upcoming elections? Corina, is AI being implemented? In the electoral debates, how big of an effect can it have?
Um, I don't think I'm qualified to talk about AI, but perhaps one idea for people who actually know the topic and can think this through. One of the issues as we're moving into doing more things online is aggregating opinion and creating a virtual space for debate, particularly political debate. And I think there's a wide conversation happening at the moment in the US around organizing the political party conventions and making sure that the voices of different communities are being heard in the process of nominating candidates and exercising the right to vote, so on and so forth. And perhaps there is scope for technology there to make sure that this process of channeling voices and making sure that a variety of groups and opinions are being featured and represented, maybe technology can play a role in that. The particulars of that, how that might work, I don't know. I'm not in a position to answer. And to my knowledge, I don't think that's being used all that much. With the exception of perhaps if you're monitoring disinformation campaigns online, to a certain extent, machine learning is being used, but not when it comes to elections. But if I may, just a brief 10-second note on the previous question, and I fully agree with Zofia and Beata, and I see two potential implications there. One, civil society. And I think that's something that we really need to focus on in the next months and years. Of course, civil society organizations are being impacted by this crisis and the fact that we're shifting a lot of activities online. And I think that's where the international community and Poland and other countries, Hungary's international partners can play a role in supporting groups on the ground with whatever they need, if only to amplify their voices outside the borders of their own countries, help them reconnect or connect in a more effective way with their constituencies, have the resources they need, so on and so forth. And I think throughout the process of European integration, we've seen the tremendous role that the EU backing has played for local actors supporting reform and kind of fighting for those reforms to be sustainable. And then secondly, I think whatever the response is to democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe among EU and NATO members will have an impact on aspiring countries in, for instance, Eastern Partnership countries or Western Balkan countries. I think the strength and the effectiveness of the response will have an impact on how these other countries are calibrating their own actions, both domestically and in relation to their international partners. Thank you.
Thank you for this insight. I would like to go back a bit to AI in a way, connected with the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of social media platforms have eventually declared that they have to imply more AI and algorithms for fact-checking because of these security measures that are limiting their human fact-checkers. And my question may be to Zofia, who has been conducting election monitoring now during the Polish electoral campaign. Have you seen the measures taken by social media platforms in Poland to be effective? I mean, are they taking down the content, malign content from their platforms, not only when it comes to the elections, but also connected to COVID? And are their actions sufficient?
So yes, we've seen cases of social media platforms, especially Facebook, acting out from those policies of content being taken down, and also with those let's say, notifications that I'm sure you've all seen about how this is an information center on the COVID related matters, and you can access everything here. And I think this is helpful, especially to those people who are not entirely aware of the situation. And I'm also thinking of other countries, not necessarily Poland. I personally work a lot with Belarus, who has been struggling a lot with this pandemic, and especially with the lack of information from the state, as you've mentioned before. I mean, President Lukashenko's response has been absolutely disastrous, and this has impacted the level of information in the country quite significantly. So I think social media platforms have quite a significant role to play in this situation. In terms of election, I think the level of debate and the heat in the debate in Poland is still quite high. We're a country with that is quite polarized, especially in this situation with regards to the election. So we've seen a couple of posts being taken down, but also I think there is another side to this as well, because we personally, as a foundation, we have our accounts in social media. We've been trying to recruit domestic election observers in the past couple of weeks to observe this election in Poland, and we've also been faced with this issue where our posts have been taken down because they have been deemed too political. So I mean, this is definitely a right direction for social media platforms to be taking more action on this. However, I think this should still be more calibrated, more maybe less dependent on AI in some cases, and more still involving actual human beings to kind of be able to see what kind of content really needs to be filtered out of the system and what kind of content should stay.
Thank you very much for this insight of Polish social media. Well, unfortunately, our time designated for this debate and webinar is up. I think that we covered a lot of issues, and I think that all of us came into conclusion that there are still a lot of things that all countries need to be working on. Corina outlined very interesting measures, and it is not something that needs to be taken and accomplished within these pandemic times, but it's something that we need to continuously work on and continuously increase the resilience of our electoral systems and build the resilience of our society. An important note and I think understanding of this debate is that elections are, should be inclusive. And we need to build the trust of new measures. I mean, we need to build trust of people to make sure that they completely understand these new measures that are being implemented, and that these new measures are properly communicated, and there are a lot of time for them to be properly communicated, and voters to adopt them and completely understand them, so that nobody has any doubts in future about the electoral process that is going to take place. Thank you very much for joining me today. I thank you all for finding time and joining this debate and sharing your know-how from both sides of the Atlantic. I would say good luck, Zofia, for the upcoming elections, whether they're going to take place or not take place. But this is like the most urgent thing that is happening when it comes to elections now in Poland. If you're interested in similar debates, tomorrow we're continuing a debate on NATO's defense and deterrence agency agenda. Going to happen tomorrow. More information you can find on our social media platforms. But please stay home, stay safe, and be healthy. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.